welcome to the latest episode of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Page, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing criminal law abolitionism in the context of international criminal law with our guests, Sanam Amin, a PhD scholar at Melbourne Law School, and Dr. Sophie Rigney, a senior lecturer at RMIT School of Law. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. And before we get down to business, our traditional first question, Sanam, Sophie, what's your drink?
I have with me a caramel rooibos, and I've kept this mug, which was a gift from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact to drink it in.
Fantastic. And because podcasting is a very visual medium, it's a super cute, I would say, pink mug with different pink polka dots.
It's very cute. I'm also having a tea. I'm having a French Earl Grey, which is a delightful little mid-afternoon treat, I think.
Fantastic. And in keeping with the tea theme, I'm also having tea, which is kind of usually my thing. And I'm having a black gold Bilachan, which is a black tea with kind of floral and chocolatey notes from Yunnan province in China.
Mm,
So
delicious.
tea all round. Perfect.
Also, just cold weather feelings.
Right? It's been
Mhm.
winter has hit in Canberra. I don't know what it's been like for y'all in Melbourne, but
It's
winter
hit.
has
It's hit.
it's hit last, like we've had rain, it hasn't gotten above 10 degrees. It's like suddenly it's winter, and I'm like, this is both wonderful, but also, oh, it's cold.
Yeah. And I saw in the news this week snow has arrived in the mountains as well.
Oh, lovely. I'm hoping to get to go down and spend some time around snow because I miss snow from living in North America. So, but that's an aside. Now, um, Sophie, you and I have known each other for a while. If memory serves, we met through Ansel when you were doing your PhD and I was doing my MPhil kind of around 2013. We've moved in each other's orbits somewhat to varying degrees since then. And Sanam, we met more recently, and if I recall correctly, it was when you attended the Kill 2 workshop in November of 2022, and then ran the Romancing the Tome 2 workshop and special issue of the AFLJ that I took part in with a piece I co-authored with my former honours student who has just submitted her PhD, Emma Genovese, and that paper was on queerness as freedom. Would you all like to kind of correct my memory or tell this from your perspective?
I think, yeah, you've got it completely right from my perspective. I think that's right. It was Ansel in Canberra from memory, and I think it was the, um, sort of PhD candidate day that they have before the start of Ansel that I sort of remember distinctly you being there. And then I seem to remember the dance floor at Ansel and us being on the dance floor. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but
That sounds like something I would have done.
seems
Yeah.
seems accurate. Yeah, and ever since then, I've really been absolutely in awe of both your like incredible body of scholarship, but also the way that you really like bring out the best in people. And I've always had a lot of respect for the way that you really live your integrity in academia. So it's been very cool to, as you say, sort of like come in and out of each other's orbits over that period of time. I'm very grateful for all that you do.
Oh, thank you. That's, I said, I'm a little embarrassed, but yes, I do vaguely recall dance. For I definitely enjoy getting my dance on even now, so it seems likely.
I'll say that you have an excellent memory, actually, Tamsin. Yes, I learned so much from you and Clairwyn at Queering International Law 2.0, and because of how wonderful that workshop was, and since I was sort of always relying on Clairwyn for other PhD things anyway, I did consult her a lot in organizing Romancing the Tomes 2.0, which Sophie participated in as well as our other co-editor for the special issue that we'll be talking about, Yasin Brunger. She attended as she was a visitor at Melbourne Law School at the time. And of course, both those 2.0 workshops had the wonderful support of Diane Otto. So thinking through all of those connections that you reminded me of also makes me think, like there's a lot of unwritten background, not just the dancing and the joy, but also like that nurturing, that, planting of little seeds of feminist collaboration that just sort of carries on and on and on. And
Yeah.
I will also embarrass you some more. I'm a huge fan of one of your particular talks on storytelling and international law.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of my next big project for when I finally tie up this law and literature book. I've got the piracy book in press. The law and literature book just needs to be finished written so I can move on to storytelling as legal method and do a kind of a whole treatise on legal method through the framework of storytelling. It's the
Well,
next
you have
big
one person
project.
hotly anticipating that project.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And on your note about the seeds of feminist collaboration, that kind of is a really lovely callback to the episode we did on Call to the Bar with Hillary and Christine and Di, where they kind of said, look, the feminist career in international law is the connections and networks that and relationships that you build along the way. And so that's a really nice kind of callback to that ideal of a feminist career. And speaking of careers, neither of you have been on the pod before. So we usually start by asking new guests, how did you get into international law and what brought you to your present position and role and what you're doing now?
Sanam, do you want to go first?
Sure. I was just like, how do I summarize my haphazard trajectory? Because it kind of, honestly, it's 10 years ago since I did my LLM. And 10 years ago, I would not have predicted that I'd be in Australia doing a PhD. Because before I did my master's, I was just like, I'm not clever enough, nor do I have the capacity to do. But let me track back a bit. So my family's originally from Bangladesh, which is a funny place to be from because Bangladesh is younger than my parents. They were born citizens of East Pakistan. My grandparents were subjects of the British Raj in India. So, like, I actually have some of my grandparents and parents' old passports, and you see those changes in those documents over time. So, my original first degree was in English literature because I was a writer, and I still am a writer at heart. And I worked as a journalist for national news media in Bangladesh, did a lot of, human interest stories, and then kind of got caught up in a lot of things that happened. And I'll jump forward in time a little bit. But basically, the journalism and writing work got me into human rights work. I worked for a human rights NGO in Thailand, but working with Southeast Asia sort of branch of the Fédération Internationale des Droits Humains, FIDH, or the International Federation for Human Rights. And between those trajectories in Bangladesh and Thailand, I witnessed 2 military coups, helped put together a lot of documentation for Rohingya community, for ethnic minority groups from the Women's League of Burma to try and put forward pathways of accountability against the Myanmar military. Then ended up sort of supporting the student democracy movement in Thailand. And because I was caught up in so many of these things, I was just like, okay, well, clearly I've made my way into more of a human rights career rather than a journalism career. It's time for me to maybe get a degree in international law since I'm trying to help these people do this submission for the Universal Periodic Review, trying to brief the Human Rights Council, trying to brief this special rapporteur, this UN expert on what's happening to communities on the border. So I applied to Kent Law School to do an LLM in human rights law, and then somehow became the only student to get full scholarship that year, which I'm really grateful for, because otherwise, as somebody from the third world, would never have been able to afford to do a degree like that in the first world. And then becoming a part of Kent Law School meant that I was part of that critical international law specific community that is connected to Melbourne Law School. And I'm so grateful to Luisa Slava, who taught me at the master's level, who was my second examiner, for my master's thesis, and then eventually was the person who advised me to apply to Melbourne Law School to do my PhD. So that ended up bringing me here. But in between the master's and the PhD, I also worked for a regional feminist organization, which is one of the 3 women law and development organizations founded out of the Nairobi World Conference on Women, which was the one that preceded Beijing. And so I got into a lot of feminist legal advocacy work out of Northern Thailand, working in 27 different countries across Asia and the Pacific. And I did my New York, Geneva, Rome sort of trajectory with all of these UN agencies and spaces before deciding, okay, maybe it's time to do a PhD and level up on different ways of taking this work forward. So yeah, that's, I think, the highly detailed but not too long version of how I got into international law as a third world person from a Muslim country growing up in the stark reality of the post 9/11 world.
That is a hugely fascinating story, and we need to sit down and talk about that in more detail because I have so many questions, and there are so many stories there. So, but Sophie.
Yeah, thanks. So, I think I always, I guess, had a real interest in human rights and in law and in international law. And like when I say always, my mum used to tell this story about how when I was 2 years old, I asked her about whether Colonel Gaddafi was a good man or a bad man because he'd been off talking to Michael Mansell, or rather Michael Mansell had been off talking to him. So a Tasmanian Palawa Aboriginal man had gone to talk about self-determination and nationhood and passports and things like that. And so, that was something that was really discussed in the home that I was being raised in right from the get-go. And I think my dad's father had been a displaced person from World War II, from Poland. He had been taken as forced farm labour into Germany at the age of 16 and then had made his way through DP camps in Europe and eventually to Australia. And I think growing up with that kind of history and understanding of what conflicts do to everyday people really affected my career trajectory. My dad was then a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, the American Imperial War in Vietnam, and he had the support of Quakers to be a conscientious objector, and so he became a Quaker. My mother became a Quaker when she met him, and so I was raised in a Quaker household and had a Quaker education, and again that really, meant that I was being raised in a home where we were frequently talking about anti-militarism and about the importance of creating a better world, I guess, and had that really broad, outlook into the world. And again, sort of growing up around, the time of things like Nelson Mandela being freed from prison, and that being a really, again, formative moment when I was growing up, and these things always being talked about in the home. And I stayed at home during my university time, and I had a great time at university. And I think that was something that really pushed me to then want to become an academic. So that was always in my sight of vision, and it was probably always going to be law for that. But at the end of my law degree, my undergraduate law degree, my mum actually passed away in the middle of the school year, and she'd been unwell for 18 months before that, and I'd been her primary carer. But that I think has had a real, of course, has had a huge impact on how it is that I've approached life and work since then. And I think, in my academic career, just wanting to pursue work that I find meaningful, because I have this really strong sense of life being very short. But, my mum died in the middle of that final year of my law degree, and I applied for a scholarship that the University of Tasmania had for a long time. I think it still has, which is called the Hawkins Scholarship, and it funded someone to go to The Hague for a internship. It's now at the ICC. It was at the ICTY. So I went straight out of law school at the age of like 22 or something, out moved to The Hague, and ended up spending 3 years at the ICTY, at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. The first kind of 6 months was with that internship with the judges' chambers, working on the judgment in a big multi-accused Srebrenica case called the Popovic case. But then after the end of that 6 months, it was one of those kind of funny things where you couldn't get employment at the ICTY within 6 months of having completed an internship with the ICTY because it was a UN body. But the defence sat outside of that. And so if you went and did some time with defence, you could then come back and get a job with the court kind of proper. And that was my aim. But of course, I went and started working for the defence, and I ended up doing that for a couple of years. And I found that was, really interesting, important work. And I guess that has been the touchstone or the foundation stone of my academic career in terms of looking at the rights of the accused and the role of defence lawyers in international criminal law and all of those, slightly difficult topics around what the place is and the rights are of these types of individuals who are accused or convicted of committing these types of crimes. So after that, I did my PhD at Melbourne Law School and moved into academia, and have moved around over the last little bit, doing a whole bunch of different things in the UK and in Australia, including working at the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of New South Wales for a few years, specifically on the Voice to Parliament and the referendum and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now settled in Melbourne. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, and rights of the accused and defense work in international criminal law is not our topic for today, but if our listeners are interested in it, you can go back and re-listen to the episode we did with Kate Gibson, who's current defense counsel in the ICC, specifically on that issue. So as a kind of context there, if you want more on the sorts of things that Sophie was doing at the ICTY. All right. On to our main topic, which is abolition and ICL. Now, in my experience as a criminal law abolitionist, the idea of abolitionism is widely misunderstood and misrepresented, usually by people who think that cops are all that stand between society and some sort of Hobbesian purge. Can you explain for our listeners what is meant by criminal law abolition, both in an idealistic and utopian level, but also at the practical day-to-day level?
Yeah. Well, I might just kick off, but Sanam, jump in at any point as well. I think that, what you've just said it definitely demonstrates the limited imagination a lot of us have by virtue of the fact that we've sort of, grown up in these systems where law enforcement means police and prisons, right? And actually that's a very limited way of thinking through what accountability is, what human relations are. But a lot of people sort of do really get very concerned when they think you're going to be taking away the police and the criminal law system, because people can't really imagine anything other than that. But actually abolitionists have done an awful lot of work in imagining what comes after police and prisons. And of course, police and prisons have only been a really modern way of addressing societal problems. So actually what has been made can be unmade and remade, and that's something that I think is really core to abolitionist thought. And I think that that's particularly true at the particularly true or true in a different way at the ICL level, because we have this really, like Gary Simpson says, it's this passionately punitive system, right? Everything seems maxed in international criminal law. And so it's really built on the idea that we need to punish in a particular way for these atrocities through a carceral system. But we can absolutely move beyond that. And I've got a bunch more things to say, but I might just see if Sanam wants to come in at that point as well.
Yeah, I think you've put the framing really well, Sophie. I was thinking, particularly since Tamsin, you've said, oh, what is the ideal and what is the day-to-day? because that's such a nice way of thinking about the longer goal that we're building towards and what do we want to do now, right? And like the vision is something much bigger and more beautiful, right? That's the ideal, because we're not just talking about no prisons. We're talking about let's build a world that works for us, that takes care of everybody, that shares equitably. Um, and like to me, the prison abolition is a piece of that feminist utopia, that feminist imagining. And like it's also about building public transport systems that work for everybody. That is not all about bringing everybody to the urban center, but recognizes that most travel, especially women and communities do, is circular travel. Like that's one of my big frustrations, even though I love the transport systems we have in Melbourne in particular. Sydney is also wonderful, but like you have this constant problem in Melbourne that like as soon as you go to an outer suburb, you can't take a bus or a train directly from one outer suburb to another, even if they're next to one another, right? You have to travel back to center and then out. Like for example, I live Frankston Way. Sandringham is right there. I can't just take a sort of connecting train between the Sandringham and Frankston lines. I would have to go all the way back at least to Caulfield to find my way back. So like that's the bigger vision of like having a just, more beautiful world that takes care of people, that takes care of the environment. And like if we have that longer goal in mind that we're building towards, then it's kind of like doing the sort of power mapping and just doing a sort of Gantt chart to be like, okay, what does it take to build that world in 1 year, in 10 years, in 50 years? And when you do that kind of thinking, then you're just like, okay, well, the first step on many levels is that popular education part of it, which is partially what we're doing in the academic work, in having this conversation with you today, in doing the special issue as well, and making people realize that the misunderstandings that they have are quite off, right? Because one of the initial responses that I'm quite familiar with is that, oh, so you want the murderers and rapists to go free? And I'm just like, well, sorry to disappoint you, but the murderers and rapists with money, with a sympathetic judge who's worried about the future of this young man and not the young woman that he has sexually assaulted, is going free. In fact, some of these unfortunate young men make them all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States after telling you how much he liked beer, right? And we know for a fact that it's not just the people who have power, privilege, and wealth and resources don't get punished as we want them to, but also the weakest and most vulnerable communities are the ones most hurt by this. And our systems are not good at making sure that those biases and prejudices that we have in Australia, certainly it is towards First Peoples, who are most overrepresented in the prison systems. And I keep reminding people every day that you jail children here, and it is not normal. And the fact that you accept this as normal is a first starting point that we need to challenge. But on a practical level, that I would say that we need to do now, is like, why are we spending so much money on prisons? That is not a viable thing that I think should sit in our budgets. This is money and resources that can go towards other things. So like the day-to-day reality of how justice systems are neither actually punishing the people who need to be punished, nor are they serving us in terms of the spending of public money towards things that we need, is the kind of ways that I try to pick up these conversations. But ultimately, like, it is also in service of a larger understanding of what do we really need for ourselves, our communities, to move forward in face of injustice? Is the punishment of a perpetrator actually going to heal us? Is it going to actually prevent other such crimes from happening? And a lot of data tells you not. And Sophie is an expert on some of these areas. And I think I want to pivot to you to speak to that point as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you say, obviously. But just picking up a couple of things, you've talked about like the budget, right, for prisons and police. And one of the key abolitionist scholars and thinkers is a woman called Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she's a geographer by training. And as you know, a lot of the key abolitionists these are Black Marxist feminist writers, right? And all of that's super important for thinking about how these people understand world building is actually a really material, important exercise that has real world consequences, right? But she sets out this idea of what she calls organized abandonment. So it's like the idea that governments make decisions every single day about where they're spending their money and where they're making their investments. And they are deliberately investing in prisons and police at the expense of communities and care. And they do so in order to create the opportunities that then prisons and police exploit, right? So if you've got a poor community that you are not investing in, you're not investing in their public transport, like Sanam's been talking about, you're not investing in their healthcare, you're building an AI data center next to them and making all of their water undrinkable and their microclimate uninhabitable, then that then creates opportunities for what Gilmore says is extraction and revenue generation, and then carceral enforcement to fill the gaps of what actually should be investment in communities. And so, if we then translate that to the international level, you also say, well, our governments are choosing to invest in militaries and wars. They're not choosing to invest in the NDIS in Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They're not choosing to invest in health and education. In Victoria, we've got some of the worst paid teachers, in the country. And, our kids are sitting in schools, with ratios of teachers and students that should not be acceptable and all of those types of things. And yet we're very happy to invest in the military and in wars and in, absolute devastation. So part of this abolition question is saying, what would our shared life look like if we flipped all of that over and we invested in people and communities and health and education? And if we abolish the police and prisons and surveillance and abolish the military industrial complex, we would have this huge amount of money, right, to do other things with. And yeah, as Sanam sort of pointed out, whilst a lot of people, I think, deliberately misunderstand abolitionists and sort of say that they're naive and that, the roads are going to be filled with the murderists and rapists and all of those things, and that abolitionists don't have a clear agenda for what comes next. Actually, there's been an awful lot of work done to think through that world building enterprise that's really at the heart of it. So it's not just about what we get rid of, it's about what we build. And it's actually about making sure that prisons and police are unthinkable. They are unnecessary. We do not need them because we've got other things that ensure that we have conditions where people don't need to commit various crimes, right?
I have a follow-up question on this whole structure because it's kind of brought me to mind of a chapter in my unfinished book where I talk about the role of the fine in society as a method of poverty and social hierarchy structural enforcement, like to maintain poverty, to provide a pliant workforce, etc. How would you say criminal law fits into that sort of framework of social engineering and maintaining of social hierarchy? Sorry, that's off script, so you haven't had a chance to think through it.
No, absolutely, I would say. And again, if you look, at someone like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's done an awful lot of work on that, economic side of things, right? And that actually these are all capitalist systems designed to ensure particular workforces, particularly, in places like the US, where the prison system is a source of labor as well, right? So
here too.
Yeah, here too. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So you have some really powerful economic drivers of the prison system. And yeah, a lot of it is geared towards particular workforces and keeping particular workforces in and out of circulation.
Yeah, I mean, my entry point was different. I came through Austin Turkin conflict theory about crime as a rational response to powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how I came to abolitionism as an ethos. So there are lots of people who have been working on this for decades.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. And I just thought of a very small anecdote in relation to what you were saying, Sophie, about like we need teachers and all that. I literally met a couple of weeks ago somebody who used to work as a teacher's aide, and it did not pay enough. They had layoffs at the school. And so now he's working as a prison officer.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he kept assuring me that, look, it's a low security one, so we don't have the crazy turnover that we have at the high security ones. And so it's not as terrible a work environment. And that's just a sort of like, of course, it's anecdotal. It doesn't answer for the hundreds of prisons and detention centers and juvenile sort of correctional facilities across this continent. But it's very illustrative of like how we meet this person every day. How here in Victoria, like I keep seeing adverts, whether that's like online or even on SBS for Corrections Victoria. They're just constantly advertising and trying to hire, because the Ravenhall now has, I think, 700 beds. Every time they rebuild and do repairs for these prisons, they expand them. And they just cannot keep the workforce needed because it's a very high pressure, hostile environment. And not to diminish the horrible conditions for the people in prison, but it is also a terrible place for the people who work there. It destroys you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we have this ethic of abolitionism, and we have I think, a very clear ethic of why we have abolitionism. How do we translate that ethic into international criminal law, which is, as you said, it's highly punitive? I know I've had lots of conversations with Kate Gibson about how it's not representative of any criminal law system that you find domestically, because it's all about punishment rather than accountability.
Mm.
And can you also, with that, then give us some examples of what abolitionism would do for international criminal law?
So, like, I started thinking about this, I guess, in 2021, and when we were witnessing, a lot of movement with the Black Lives Matter protests, and I was working at the Indigenous Law Centre, and sort of, hearing those stories of people here in the domestic Australian setting linking the need for transformative approaches to law to what has always, what happens in this settler colonial state. And I guess, I'd always had that interest in defendants' rights that we talked about, but I'd always also been quite committed to the project of international criminal law, and had always just been like, let's just throw more procedure at the problem, right? Like, let's reform it, and let's make the procedure better, and let's, tinker around the edges, which is a really very seductive thing in a sort of neoliberal legal setting, I guess. But when I was witnessing those Black Lives Matter protests and talking to my colleagues, and, I sort of began to think, well, a lot of the problems that we see at the domestic level and the things that abolitionists are calling for at the domestic level, is replicated at the international level. And so I tried to bring the sort of critical approaches to international criminal law literature into conversation with abolitionist approaches. And I wrote an article which was published in the Journal of International Criminal Justice on building an abolition movement for international criminal law. And really making this argument that, like, ICL is a carceral system, right? It responds to mass atrocities deliberately through punishment and imprisonment, by holding people to be individually responsible for mass atrocities, right? It individualizes the responsibility for these things that are typically large-scale, collective, societal problems and atrocities that occur. And then it individualizes the punishment by putting someone in prison. Like, that is the system of law. And instead, a carceral abolition movement for ICL would say, well, we should refuse imprisonment and policing as the main responses to mass atrocity. And instead, we should understand the social causes and conditions that cause those atrocities, and actually try to, put that in its structural understanding of what, and it's going to come down to money and power and land and all of those types of things, but like actually try to reckon with those social causes and conditions that cause mass atrocity, but also that structure the criminality and allow some individuals to be caught by the criminal law system and not others. And I think ICL is just like other domestic systems in this regard, where criminality is structured to deliberately capture some individuals and to exonerate and make innocent other individuals. And obviously we see powerful states flaunting international criminal law or not being captured by international criminal law, while others are disproportionately represented in that legal system. And obviously it's sort of linked to global capitalism, race, imperialism, as well as a structural bias towards neoliberalism and to really like criminalizing and placing that individual responsibility and individualism at the heart of a carceral response to social harm. And, we can talk about a whole bunch of things like how selectivity is really inbuilt in international criminal law when it comes to like what kinds of things can be charged, jurisdiction, temporal jurisdiction, geographic jurisdiction, and the types of core crimes that exist under the Rome Statute, all of which structure criminality in particular ways. But yeah, I might leave it at that for now. I've got more to say though, but I might let Sanam come in at this point.
Oh, you've given me so many rabbit holes to go into, Sophie. I think foremost on my mind, because I just finished teaching international criminal justice to some undergrads this semester. And so I've been going through in detail all of these different case studies, and the Sierra Leone case study particularly resonated with a lot of my students, because we're just like, okay, there were a few different processes. A couple of them ran simultaneously. One perpetrator wanted to be in this process, and then he was told he can't, and all of that. And then I talked about the fact that, well, even this process, the different international criminal processes that happened, the special court and all of that, even those were still quite removed from rural communities and all these sort of sites that had experienced this great trauma. And then I showed them, a little bit about fumble talk, and here's one pathway of a reparative kind of pathway, and like maybe you'll have judgments about some of the ways that it's gone about, but actually, we think that justice processes are for the ones who are gone, like the people who have suffered and died, but actually everything that we do in this world is also for the ones who have lived and who have survived. And how are we going to move forward and live with not just the survivors, the victims, their families who have this huge trauma, but also the people that we are labeling perpetrators, who like, once you learn more and you're in that space more, or if you've lived through that, that it's a complicated relationship, and that a lot of these things, it's not deviant. It becomes a peer pressure experience to be part of, to be complicit in mass atrocity. So like when we try and sort of export domestic criminal frameworks for deviancy into international atrocity sort of processes, we fumble and expand something that was already problematic to start with. And Diodo and Karenigo and Vasuki Nasai have also commented on, or written about, about the fact that there is a success of a particular type of carceral approach that certain feminist scholars have advocated for, that was easy to be adopted into a certain structure of power that Sophie has identified as neoliberal. But there were alternative imaginings and framings, and there continue to be different ways of imaginings, including reparative imaginings of how we want to go about these issues. And like these kinds of imaginings are not isolated from broader issues such as ecological justice, right? Because people who listen to this podcast may or may not be familiar, but there is a trajectory about how do we amend the Rome Statute to recognize ecocide as a crime. And that becomes kind of what Sophie was saying, like, how do we make more law? Because this law isn't, like a lot of the time you think that, oh, this bit of law isn't working, so what we need is more law. But you don't think about that structural issue. And I'm not denigrating what is happening in that ecocide movement, because that ecocide movement has a longer history in Vietnam, in the incredible damage that the Americans have wrought with the napalm, with the Agent Orange, with everything that is still in the blood of Vietnamese peoples today, and the destruction they have done in the environment there. So, like, there are longer conversations to be had about accountability in different forms, justice in different forms, reparative justice, ecological justice, and all of that, that this carceral approach is just too limited for. And as we expand it, it shows bigger holes than what we already know at a domestic level.
Go on.
I was going to say, I have an anecdote on that note of more crime, where I examined an honors thesis that used Sophie's abolition in international criminal law as the basis of an argument of adding more crimes to the Rome Statute, which was, I'm just like, oh, that's kind of missing the point of the whole argument. But at a point that this is kind of raised for me is one of the consistent arguments I've made as like, I'm pretty against international criminal law as a basis of law, because I have always seen it as a way of scapegoating individuals for the crimes and actions of states. And so I was wondering if you'd like to kind of weigh in or respond to kind of my position, because you are both better international criminal lawyers than I am, because of my kind of rejection of it as a body of law.
I'll sort of, because, like, I fully agree with you that the only successes that we have really seen has been scapegoating, and I don't just say scapegoating individuals, but contributing to our imagination of this perfect villain sitting there rubbing his hands and doing evil, when actually, like, some of the sort of bigger explanations and understandings that we have of oppression, of prejudice, of violence coming from xenophobia, from casteism, from racism, and so on, like, that's much more complicated than the perfect villain. Even though, like, you have your, at the moment, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu really playing the role of perfect evil villain, cartoon villain. But like, also the thing is that, like, this, because international law generally, and international criminal law specifically, relies so heavily on states cooperating with one another, that you do see that problem that Audre Lorde speaks of, that ultimately the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Having said that, like I said, this is also about, like, we haven't figured out the other solutions for accountability for moving forward that work for us. And also, we haven't had the political momentum and interest for those solutions, rather than neoliberal solutions, to be taken up in a broad way. Nevertheless, I think we are also seeing these sort of moments of take back in a certain sense, because even as flawed and as neoliberal and as imperial as these structures are, it is like the International Court of Justice. It's the season of the International Court of Justice. Never has it had so many applications. They are behind in providing all these advisory opinions. The most recent one, as we record, on the right to strike, which the ILO turned to them because they were worried about encroachment and by states on what was previously an established right. And I bring this up because even with all of these flaws, you see South Africa bringing this the sort of case to the International Court of Justice. You see Palestinian human rights organization most recently bringing forward this preliminary discovery application to Australia, requesting that the defense minister disclose the arms permits that are current and being in use right now. And that hearing was supposed to take place last Friday and has been postponed. I don't know what the new date will be. And I'm not saying that this is a system that might work, but you're seeing how in a flawed structure, still there are global South communities finding ways to use these tools against imperialism. And we don't know how, the die is going to roll out. The story is still being written.
But those examples that Sanam has just given, I think the power in them is that they place the emphasis precisely where it should be, which is the responsibility of states and the responsibility of businesses, right? So we're not, when we say abolish international criminal law, we're talking about abolishing a carceral system that holds an individual responsible and then puts them in prison. But there are all sorts of other mechanisms for accountability for these types of crimes, which can include things like the legal processes which say to a state, this is not acceptable, right? And places it at the level of the state, not at the level of just throwing Benjamin Netanyahu in prison or whatever, because that's not going to fix it, actually. Putting those individuals in prison is not going to fix what has happened in the context of Palestine. And so we need to be looking in different ways. And I think, the world-building exercise of abolition and international criminal law is saying, well, let's take a broader look. Let's be thinking about, the factories, including in Australia, where people are building the munitions to send to the US for sending on to Israel, right? Let's be thinking about that in connection with the boardrooms where decisions are being made about who profits from these types of atrocities and how to extract labor in order to make death more profitable. Let's be thinking about, various communities who are suffering that organized abandonment that I talked about earlier, which means that it's a very rational choice for a poor, typically Black kid to decide to be a participant in the military, to provide their labor to the military because they have very few other options, right? And this is, it's all geared towards saying these are structural conditions that materially benefit states and companies and billionaires. We need to stop that. That's what we need to be thinking about, and that's what we need to be looking at. And one other point that I wanted to make, I'm not sure if it's directly related to that, but we frequently think about ICO as happening in this sort of rarefied international plane in The Hague. But the reality is that international criminal law is reliant upon domestic prison systems to do the work of putting people in prison. Now, of course, there are limited numbers of people who have been put in prison for international crimes, but at the same time, this is a really significant point because if someone is convicted at the ICC, they will be then typically transferred to another host state who puts them into their domestic prison system. So you see people in prison in France or the UK or whatever, and who are subject to that country's prison system and prison conditions. And these are very bleak places, right? Prisons are designed to be punitive and carceral and unpleasant and places where you are literally putting a human being in a cage in a way that will likely lead to expedited illness, mental illness, death. And so although people think, oh, you're talking about international criminal law, we're actually talking about the domestic prison system too. And if we're thinking about we need to abolish the domestic prison system as part of our abolition project, then that's really, what we're talking about as well, that we need to abolish the places where international criminals are being kept. And so the international is the domestic, and increasingly we are also seeing domestic prosecutions for international crimes. So in Australia, the ISIS brides, the so-called ISIS brides, Ben Roberts-Smith, like we're actually seeing at the moment a massively increased rate of these types of prosecutions. And again, that's happening within the domestic prison and policing system. So yeah, I think that's really important. And some of my recent research attempted to map some of this, like this kind of complicated dynamic between the international criminal legal system and the domestic prison system. And it's really bleak. It's really punitive. Some of the behavior that happens in prisons, ironically enough, under other circumstances, might form the conditions to be something that somebody could be charged with, like for a war crime and things like that. And again, we have to be asking why it's appropriate to be engaging in these types of systems, even for individuals who have committed, truly awful mass atrocities. And we're not denying any of that, but why, we're only adding to the suffering of the world, like if we're responding in that way.
No, 100%. And thank you for reminding that point. The domestic and the international are so closely interrelated. And Daryl Lee makes this point specifically about the global prison system and the national domestic level prison system, that actually don't think of these as separate. They're working together. They're cycling all of these racialized bodies, third world bodies, through these systems. That's how Saudi, Palestinian, Libyan, Syrian bodies get cycled around, not just in the very famous extreme end of Guantanamo, but in different domestic prison sites, as these individuals charged with these crimes that get stripped of nationalities or are sent to where they're supposed to come from, where they never lived, and so on and so forth. And to sort of bring it home, the international doesn't function without the domestic, right? We've spoken about the fact that it's arms produced here, it's fighter jet components produced here in Australia that goes out there. But listeners will not know, but in my background that Sophie and Tamsin might be able to see, I do have a poster that says "Close Pine Gap." And that's such an crucial linchpin to how this current series of conflict attacks in Lebanon and other sites are taking place, right? Pine Gap has expanded in the last few years. It is the only US military base that is inland. And the reason that it's so far inland is, unlike all of the other naval bases and island bases and all of that, that's not where they're launching the attacks. That's inland so that it can avoid any type of interception from China or Russia sort of passing ships. And this is where drone surveillance is coordinated from. The data of global surveillance is done from here. And that's local Australians. Of the 1,000 staff members that work at Pine Gap, 500 are Australians and 500 are NSA, CIA, whoever. So all of that day to day in Northern Territory, that work goes into the international, the conflict, the war crimes, everything that you perceive as external and far away is actually very much present here. Because the imaginings of humanitarian law from 2 centuries ago, the battlefield is not there or closed off in a way that humanitarian law had envisioned, that in this space where the battle is taking place, here are the protections for the medics and the prisoners of war. No, that's not how we're in this globalized, capitalized, digitalized world that it works anymore. And just as you have to think of it almost like the human body, and the fact that the digestive system and the circulatory system and the nervous system are all close to each other physically, and also intertwined and working together.
Yeah, that's all really good points. And so, kind of moving on, what's one thing you want listeners to take away about abolition, and what would you recommend they read on the topic besides the excellent special issue of AFLJ that you both edited on the topic?
I have actually in my bookshelf Veronica Gorrie's Black and Blue, and that is an amazing story of how somebody who genuinely thought the problem is police don't know enough about my community, actually went, she I think was one of the first or the first Indigenous female police officer. And as she works through her experience and lives this life, she comes to that conclusion that there is nothing that you can fix within the police as an institution, but it is something that has to be abolished. And Veronica Gorrie has also edited an excellent collection called When Cops Are Criminals, and there all these amazing stars have also written in that collection as well, Amanda Porter and so on and so forth. And I guess aside from Veronica Gorrie, Chelsea Wadago, Debbie Kilroy, all of these folks have done excellent writing on that. Moving beyond this continent, I keep recommending people to read Haunani-Kay Trask generally, but also specifically from a native daughter. And, it's just kind of bring home the fact that we're talking about colonialism as an interlinked sort of form and process. And I do also recommend, if you want to think in that expanded way, not just about abolition, but about how interlinked these systems of colonialism and imprisonment are, Santilla, I'm going to terribly mispronounce this, Santilla Chingaipe, Black Convicts, How Slavery Shaped Australia, because she makes this excellent point and analysis that slavery laws that the British set up in Barbados are interconnected, because as they continued in different colonies, they just kept adding to that legislation and adapting that legislation. So by the time they get to the first fleet gets to Australia, that is a sophisticated body of colonial law. And even when slavery gets abolished, all of these elements remain of a colonial system that still imprisons and also imagines the Black body as criminal.
I would really recommend people go back to reading abolitionists as well. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, Mariana Macaba, Dorothy Roberts. I think a lot of the things that I've seen, some of them I think haven't read that work in enough depth. And I think it's really crucial to go back and read that work properly. And then I think, Karen Engle's done some really fantastic work on abolition and human rights specifically, but it's interesting the way that I think that's developed from initially her work on anti-impunity in international criminal law, and then moving to a specifically clearly abolitionist kind of stance. And I think there's a chapter in your edited collection, Tamsin, on queer encounters with international law together with Clayton O'Hara, that's really useful. And then I think Maxine Kamari-Clark's work on racial biases in ICL is really useful. And I mean, look, there's a whole bunch. Malik Drumbull's work in 2007. There's a whole bunch of that critical approaches to international criminal law work that, you can just there's a lot there. But I think as well that what is one thing for listeners to take away about abolition is if what we've said has sparked an interest, go away and do some of the reading and come and have a chat and whatever, because this is a community and it's a movement, right? And we welcome people into it, even if it's something new or it's not been something that they felt particularly comfortable with in the past. But it's everyone's welcome into the movement, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And we're always learning. I realize that we've spoken with such enthusiasm and great detail about the things we know about and the things we've read about, but I feel that I still learn every day, especially from folks with lived experiences. Whenever I play Two Truths and a Lie, I like to be I've never been arrested, only detained. And people don't believe me because I've been in so many sort of protests and that kind of thing. But then it becomes a teaching moment to be do you know the difference between detention and arrest? But precisely because of that, I always defer to folks who have lived experience of incarceration, because
Yeah.
just like nobody can speak for Palestinians the way Palestinians can. Nobody can speak about the great, great damage and harm that prisons do than those who have lived it.
Fantastic. Thank you for what has been a really kind of, I think, deep and rich discussion in this episode. We are going to need to wrap up. And in wrapping up, we usually ask a non-international law question about escape routes, what you're reading, listening, or doing that takes your mind off international law. But in season 3, I am still yet to be informed of the official question, so I'm continuing with my comfort food question. So, what is your ultimate comfort food? Where can you get the best version? And where can listeners find a good recipe?
I think this is the hardest question of all, right? I don't feel like I have a comfort food. Like there's nothing that I turn to when I'm feeling like sad, or there's nothing that I like make. I mean, food is very like inbuilt in the rituals that we have in our family for sure. Like the closest to a comfort food might be like if I'm sick, I really like to have a hot black currant juice and like a crumpet with some honey and butter and stuff. But what I would say is that, and like it kind of fits the theme of community building as well. One thing that has been really crucial to me is there was a cake shop in North Melbourne when I first moved to North Melbourne when I was doing my doctorate, called Beatrix. I don't know if you've ever come across it, Tamsin. It doesn't exist anymore in that shop front, but Natalie Paul, who used to own it, has got 2 cookbooks out and a 3rd one coming out, and so you can recreate the recipes at home. But it was such a like wonderful community space, and Nat really like built that community around that beautiful little cake shop on the corner. And like I used to go there when I was like a single lady with my bulldog, and then I met my now husband, and like used to take him along, used to meet friends there for coffee and things like that. And over these like just chunks of
I'm
like
pretty certain we had coffee there one
you may
time.
well have, yeah. Like cocoa and sour cream, like chiffon cakes, or like coconut and lemon curd cake, like just like wildly good. And so for my 40th birthday last year as well, a friend and I actually went to do a cooking class with Natalie Paul, which was very cool. And so got to do a bit of creative work, which definitely takes your mind off the horrors.
I'm reminded. I feel like Tamsin, you once asked a favorite book question, and I was just like, no, I don't have a favorite. I need all of them. All of them. But I did once send Sophie a photo of a pile of books on the arm of my couch, and I was just like, these are my emotional support. So in that vein, and because we're experiencing the cold weather, I think I'll say what the comfort food right now with all this cold weather coming in is congis and stews. Like today I stopped by a cafe that does a sort of Asian style congee with pickled ginger and mushrooms and shallots and all of that, and that made me very happy. But I'm also thinking about ashe sabzi, which is an Iranian winter stew with barley and parsley and dill and dried lemon. So I'm going to try and put together the ingredients to make that, because last year I made a cassoulet, and I just made a huge batch of it with lots of beans and carrots and celery and all that, and like that got me through quite a few evenings, because you can freeze a bunch and then just unfreeze and warm up. And for ashe sabzi, you can find recipes online if you look for like Iranian or Persian barley stew. It's got so many herbs and tartness to it.
Yum.
Fantastic. And on the note of things you have when you get sick, my go-to when I'm sick is a roasted tomato soup with a cheese toasty. And it's got to be sourdough, and it's got to be Jarlsberg, and it's
A
got to have
grilled
lots
cheese
of
dipped in
butter.
tomato. Oh,
Yeah. That's my when I'm feeling unwell, that's my go-to. it will always make me feel better when I'm not feeling well, and that may be ridiculous, but that's kind of just my go-to if I'm feeling sick, in the way that you're hot like currant juice.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is all we have time for. So thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and we will catch you next time. Bye bye.